afternoon, everybody. I hope that you had a good lunch and that you are refreshed for this afternoon session. I'm Joy Watson. I have the delight of also being a part of Stellenbosch University in the capacity as a PhD, somebody finishing her PhD in the political science department. So this afternoon session is going to be a very important one in looking at gender-based violence and policy and its implications and how we develop policy, looking specifically at gender-based violence in institutions of higher learning. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to a very exciting panel. I think that how I'm going to do this, because some of our panelists are online, I'm going to, before each person presents, just quickly introduce them. And I'm going to really just appeal to the panelists to please keep to time, especially if you're online. It's very difficult for me to give you a sort of 5-minute nudge. And if we stick to time, then that way it's just fair on all the panelists. So first up on the program is Melissa Lucas. Is Melissa online, or is she joining us just to check? Online, okay. So Melissa is an experienced researcher with a demonstrated interest in higher education research and student affairs. She believes the power education has to change lives. She calls herself an Ubuntu chaser. It's such a lovely word, because she prides herself to always take the opportunity to build others. Experienced with higher education and gender justice research in big institutions across the country, she comes with tremendous skills in engaging with this topic. She's also a well-versed facilitator, facilitating difficult dialogues, and a trainer, academic advisor. Currently, Melissa is also a PhD candidate, employed as a residence head at the UFS and USAF project researcher. So Melissa, we look very forward to hearing you present, and if we can please just ask you to stick to the 10 minutes. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can I just get some feedback on whether you can see my screen?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, thank you. That's fine. Good afternoon, everyone. I just want to apologize. I'm a bit nasally. I got a cold a few days ago. So my name is Melissa Lucas, and I am from the University of the Free State. So I'm just going to kick off with it. Some of my research that I'll be presenting was for my postgrad years. And I will just be discussing my findings that I achieved or received from my participants. And also I'll discuss some of the higher education policies and reporting structures that I've experienced and wrote some for my institution as well as give recommendations at the end. So, a lot of the research that I've done is always coming from students' voices. I like to always be the one researcher who's always speaking on the past or the present experiences of students from themselves. I like to use the art of storytelling all the time. So yeah, one of the researchers were exploring the politics of equality, voices of female students on safety, inequality, and representation on a majority female campus. And this is basically something that was mentioned earlier. Most university campuses, or institutions rather, are majority female. Some of my findings I will share at the end for this research. Gender and human development, voices of female representative council members at the UFS. So basically this was for the SRC members, who also were a majority female council. But I will share that in the next slide, my findings. And I use the capability approach for both of these studies. also focusing on a feminist thought and human development. I used participatory methods at the end, such as storytelling, photo voice, and digital storytelling. Yes. Before I start with that, I'm just going to give you guys a short video based on word of mouth from students for digital stories that I did.
As a female student, I do not feel safe, and as a woman in full capacity, I do not feel safe, because even though I stay on campus, if I leave the walls of this campus and go outside, I still get subjected to catcalling and feeling intimidated just by men looking at you, calling you all sorts of things. So I don't think as a female I would ever feel safe, because as soon as you have to leave your place, you have to make sure that you have your paper spray, that you have all your mechanisms.
As a female student in South Africa, I feel unprotected, uncared for, and untaken care of. I need to watch where I'm walking, what time I'm walking. I need to be vigilant, extra vigilant of my surroundings, because there are predators around. I need to watch what I'm wearing, and I can't walk around freely because of a fear of somebody coming to overpower me and feel entitled to me.
So let me just go through some of the findings that I had for both researchers, and I just kind of combine them. Students still felt they were unsafe, even though they were in a female-dominated university in terms of numbers. Victims, and I think Dr. Swimmer also mentioned a lot about how victims sometimes are scared to come out. Two of the students that I interviewed, per se, were victims of well-known SRC officials, students who are in political platforms in the university, and because they've got so much support, the victims kind of were bullied and, name shamed, and a lot of people watched what happened with them and kind of kept their truth, silent, and dropped out. There's a lot of victims in my study that actually dropped out from university as a whole. Security officials. I'm not too sure, but I know that most universities do have a security official office where there's maybe even a traffic department, investigative team, and so forth. But when victims would report to these offices, students wouldn't feel the initial support from the security officers. One incident per se that always breaks my heart is that a student came crying into the security office, and the security, who was a female, basically asked her, why were you drinking and why were you dressed like that? What did you expect to happen? In front of another two police security officials in the foyer, without calling her to a separate room. She just felt, so helpless at that moment. And she's also one of the students who left the institution afterwards. Student-led political organizations. I think most institutions are somewhat led by political organizations when it comes to SRC elections and so forth. So when students feel that they're not getting the reception for their cases or what's happened to them, they report to the SRC or to political organizations on campus. But what happens is political organizations then use it for clout. They take that case and they run with it, and it's more for newspapers and media and so forth, but nobody really follows through with the case on what exactly happened to the perpetrator, where's the victim now, and so forth. So it's kind of, it'll be what's happening for 1 week and then it's gone. The perpetrators or accused walking freely. Two of my students in my studies were victims of sexual assault, and Nothing was basically communicated to them via the commission or the council that was dealing with the matter. There's the gender office and human rights office, so forth. The student 2 months later is just walking on campus and you see your perpetrator walking towards you without any warning. You don't know whether he was proven guilty. You don't know whether you won the case or nothing. And it kind of just ended there. Psychological treatment offered to victims. It should be something that's immediately provided to students as soon as the incident happens, and it should be free. Some of the psychological health officers really struggle with time slots and so forth, but something as gruesome as GBV or matters of assault and so forth should be taken seriously. This one, I think it's very important. After serving as an academic advisor, I think a lot of, especially first-year students, during the orientation weeks, I think most universities have orientation weeks, should be read out their rights as students as well. A lot of the times, students don't know where do they fall, and they still come in with high school mentality that the teacher's always right. And I think that's very wrong. So there's some kind of understanding of where your relationship could go with your facilitator, tutor, and so forth. Alcohol on campus also was a big thing in my research findings, is that most of these things, now that I'm a residence head, I see students bringing alcohol into res, which is not allowed, and most of the sexual transgressions basically take place in the residence. So the main things were victim blaming, untrained staff members, and just the inequalities of how cases were dealt with. Specifically with the LGBT plus community, they felt like females' cases were more prioritized than their cases. A lot of them received a lot of like verbal assault from lecturers and so forth. It was reported, but then it just kind of ends there. All right, and then university policy development and reporting structures. I think for me, I was a student leader in 2014, and we were kind of appalled by the fact that there was no gender-based violence or just gender policy at the university at the time, with the little knowledge of studying law at the time, and we sat down and started to draft something. But now in 2017, the official document finally came out at our university. However, I think there needs to be like a universal gender-based policy that all universities use, but also can change it and mold it to fit their institutions. And it should be mandated as well on how it's working for you, show us progress, and so forth. My recommendations to higher education institutions and gender and policy officers, as I stated before, a mandated universal gender policy, that higher education institutions should be a safe place and not mirroring the downfalls of South African government. I think the security example was a classic example of what happens in most township police stations, where you're going to report a case, but you're not receiving the type of service that you'd want. To train all staff members adequately, this I mean from contractors, builders, and security, most importantly, right up to council management who deal with these in hearings and disciplinary hearings and so forth. I feel that a lot of catcalling and so forth come from cleaning staff, gardeners, contractors, and so forth. So this is very important. Inclusive health services for reproductive health. You know, it's one thing saying that we have a medical clinic on campus, but and which provides, let's say, condoms or preventative measures for students, but rape kits, PrEP, and so forth need to be also welcomed onto the University Health Care Center, as well as transgender individuals, include their medication. Let them pick up their medication that they need from their medical health center. Why should they need to travel to different far away hospitals, whereas there is hospitals on campus who can provide for them? Also, an implementation of a GBV standby crisis team, which is available 24/7 and which follows a good protocol for every step that needs to happen, whether it is reporting to the police, psychology, moving the victim to a safer space, and so forth. There needs to be some type of protocol that each institution is following, and checks and balances there can be placed. Yes, safe places for victims, as I mentioned. A lot of victims are placed back into the residence or back into the same environment where the assault took place. There's so many people gossiping and turning the story around and around. You just trying to make sense of what just happened to you. And if we're trying not to lose these students due to these type of experiences, we need to safeguard them by all means and not just make them feel like another number. I'm going to share another storytelling now, and that's basically my closing from here.
As a female student on campus, no, I don't feel that my needs are prioritized by the university. Moreover, I feel like my needs are trampled upon. We have, as a student in my time at the UFS, I don't know how many times we've addressed so many female sensitive topics with management who've engaged at main building. We've submitted memorandums. We've spoken so many times, and there've been case after case, but nothing has been done to protect the female students. Instead of protection, there's victim blaming. And I feel that instead of the needs being protected, they are being trampled upon. And then they hide behind diplomatic answers, and they hide behind systems and structures, the very systems and structures that are implemented to not protect the female students on campus. So not only are my needs not being taken care of, my needs are being taken for granted.
They're not prioritized. We still have a university campus that is unresponsive to safety issues that women experience. We still have a university that doesn't have adequate sexual reproductive health services. We still have a university that has so many men in positions of power that are not sensitized to the needs and experiences that women have. We still have men in positions of power in terms of lecturing staff. We still have, workers at the university that aren't adequately given the necessary training. So you have outsourced workers who work in maintenance or construction work who conduct themselves in a manner that's violating to women in terms of sexual harassment. You can just go to almost every single avenue of the university and you'll see that it's geared toward men and men in positions of power in specific. So no, I don't think that women are considered, nor are the experiences considered when we look at safety, when we look at academic staff, when we look at services provided in terms of health.
Yes, I think it's good to clap. Thank you to Melissa for the very thought-provoking presentation. I was thinking as she talked about the notion of internalized fear that women carry around with them as they engage with public spaces. And I'm not sure how many of you have read the book, The Female Fear Factory by Pumla Kolo. And, that book talks to how we engage with fear as something internalized, and it limits our life choices, that it affects everything that we do. So just a really important resource. Some very important themes coming up there, and I see how Melissa calls for a universal policy that deals with issues like lack of accountability. And as we get ready to engage, to maybe just remember that we also do have an overarching policy framework for gender-based violence, the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. And that, in fact, this policy is what I'm doing my PhD on, and there's such important lessons to be learned from that process. There are very significant challenges with that, the implementation of that policy. We are stuck, very stuck in some of the areas of that work. It is not being implemented as it should. And I think that if we are going to be thinking about developing a policy for institutions of higher learning, that we need to learn from that process. Our next speaker up on the program is it a live presentation? Fantastic. You can start making your way up. Fanele Sibonge Ndabele is the coordinator for the Shared Humanity and Shared Humanity Learning Coach Models at the Center for Student Leadership. That's based here at the University of Stellenbosch. He served as the chairperson of the LGBTIQA plus community task team for Stellenbosch University campus. I'm so happy to hear that Stellenbosch University has such a task team. And the Residence Life and Culture Review, as well as the convener of the first and second annual Stellenbosch University LGBTIQ plus community roundtable. Furthermore, he has served as the secretary for the Stellenbosch University Residences and Structures Anti-GBV Working Group. I'm really looking forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you very much. I just need to adjust. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak and be a part of this very important roundtable. I had asked some colleagues during lunch that I will crack a joke at the beginning, and they need to laugh for 5 minutes so that I don't take up too much time. But I think I'm going to proceed. Yeah, so my name is Fanele Sibonge Ndabele, and I work here at Stellenbosch University. I will not repeat because it's already been stated what I do. And I've been part of Stellenbosch University as a student and now a staff member. And my journey really is one that is characterized by a wide range of engagement opportunities and platforms on a lot of issues on an institutional level. Gender-based violence being one of them, the rights and experiences of students and staff who are part of the LGBTIQA plus community. And I've been very fortunate to be a part of those spaces. And today, I will talk about some of the engagements that I had, particularly as it relates to the topic at hand, the policies that we have within our institution and the implementation of those policies and how students and staff experience the implementation of those policies. Now, of course, my knowledge is very limited, not necessarily my knowledge, but I may limit this particular presentation to Stellenbosch University, given that I have a deep understanding of how this environment operates. But of course, I do engage with how and really try to inform myself about how other institutions in South Africa and the world deal with issues of gender-based violence. And it's very interesting to see some of the overlaps and some of the lessons that we can learn from each other. As was stated in the introduction, I had the privilege of Residences and Structures Anti-Gender-Based Violence Working Group. So this working group was part of this process where there were multiple working groups, and ours specifically focused on residences and structures. So my conversation today, as it relates to policy, may be limited to that of residences and structures, but it's not in isolation. Everything that we discussed and unpacked was relevant and applicable to the greater university community and to the national narrative. In fact, we went as far as criticizing how faculties were really removing themselves from this discourse, even though they were very much part of all the issues that we are experiencing and need to come to the table in these conversations. So together in the task team, we compiled a report together with my colleagues, Ms. Ruth Andrews, and a former colleague, Ms. Anarine Prinsloo, with contributions from a diverse group of students and staff. And as I stated, the specific focus was on residences and structures, but there were a lot of overlaps with other issues that other working groups were addressing. And so when we think about some of the issues that came up and that are relevant, the issue of residence constitutions, rules, and protocol. It was stated in conversations with students, and I continue to have conversations with students and staff till this day, on how some of these residence constitutions, rules, and protocols are arbitrarily applied, resulting in the behavior of men and women being regulated differently. As you all know, in our institution, we still have a prevalence of men's residences and women's residences. And that divide still exists, continues to exist. And so it was said that the rules applied differently from men's residences compared to women's residences. And this served as a mechanism for the emergence of gender-based violence. In conversations with students who identify as non-binary or transgender students, would speak about those experiences and how they experienced that space having been allocated in a men's residence or allocated in a women's residence, and how they experienced gender-based violence in those spaces. This also results in uncertainty regarding the parameters of the roles of the and responsibilities of student leaders. So in Stellenbosch, there is really, we have a strong student leadership focus. So student leaders have a lot of influence within the residence and the institutional space. And far too often, there's really uncertainty as to what is their reach, what is their responsibility. And this creates a lot of confusion regarding the reporting of issues of gender-based violence. Another issue that arises is the drafting of some of these documents, these policy documents that exist, these constitutions and rules and regulations, and how, although the students are the focus, the students are not in the room, are not represented when this is being drafted. And so there's no resonance, there's no relatability, and these policies become so outdated as to not address the real issues that students are raising on the ground. Moving on to experiences of students and staff who are part of the LGBTIQA+ community, emphasis is placed on the residence placement policy, which has been part of a review process this year. And I made reference to experiences of mainly transgender students identify as non-binary, being placed in a men's residence or a women's residence and experiencing gender-based violence. And so you have a policy that specifically follows a certain criteria and inadvertently places students in those spaces. And I personally know of students who had to leave those spaces because of the harm and the violence that they experience in those spaces. Then I want to move on to the part of underreporting. I read an article by Professor Nuran Davids, who's part of Stellenbosch University. So she wrote a paper titled Gender-Based Violence in South African Universities, an Institutional Challenge. And I want to quote from Prof. Davids. She says, "The reasons for underreporting are wide and complex and offer a worthwhile lens through which to understand both the normalization and prevalence of gender-based violence." Prof. David continues to say that they are often trapped in intersections of relationships and normative constructions of what constitutes perpetrator and victim, talking about why do we have this prevalence of underreporting in our higher education institutions. The reality is we have students, we have policies in place, but there's a lack of implementation. There's that disconnect. So you have students talking about, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to go. I do not know who to talk to. This myself, I've heard, and I continue to have conversations with students who've experienced gender-based violence in whatever form and do not know who to speak to. You have students and staff who experience fear and express that they are scared of expressing or speaking up out of fear of being victimized, fear of being outcast, a fear of being of their story being out there and they're not being protected. And once again, I personally I have relationships with individuals who have experienced gender-based violence, have not spoken up because of fear. And we see this, that although we talk about policies that seek to address maybe sexual harassment, the behavior out there, or the reality is that individuals are just scared to speak out. With issues of shame, individuals experiencing shame, and I've alluded to that. So these are all issues that Prof. Davids really speaks about, and these are all issues that also came up in conversations with individuals as part of my work in the working group and in line with the work that I do within the student affairs space. I've been informed that I have 1 minute, so I'm just going to do my best to just sum up everything else that I want to say. I am in agreement with Prof. Davids on this point when we talk about that although most universities, our university included, may have policies that address sexual harassment, they do not fully address gender-based violence. And if we look at policies of universities across the country, it reveals that an emphasis is placed on sexual harassment without really demonstrating an awareness of the inherent complexities within the institutions of gender-based violence, within the social institution of gender-based violence. So I'm in complete agreement with Prof. Davids when she outlines that. And we see that through some policies that we have, one being the discrimination and the policy on unfair discrimination and harassment. We have policies that may speak to sexual harassment, but these policies are outdated insofar as they don't unpack gender-based violence and some go as far as not including members of the LGBTIQ+ community. So we need policies that need to be updated, that need to be in line with the times and the realities that we are experiencing today. And lastly, the reality is a lot of the policies that exist are geared towards what happens after the harm is suffered or after the gender-based violence. None of the policies really look at how can we create an environment, or create a culture, and put measures in place within our different structures institutionally to begin to educate individuals about gender-based violence, to begin to empower individuals to speak up against gender-based violence and move away really from this framework of response and remedial action, as Prof. Davids calls it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. As my last words are, it is clear that although there may be certain policies that are in place, these policies need to be updated to be in line with the times. And we need to bridge this gap that exists between drafting of policies and implementation. And one of the ways we can do this is through representation. We need to bring people around the table who are able to speak to the different experiences of the people of our country and are able to give their honest input and experience. And then we can begin to move and have policies that really speak to the realities. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was such an illuminating presentation. I really appreciate reminding us about how policies have to be participatory so they speak to the lived realities of those that they are meant to represent. And also you're bringing in the limitations of using constructions, binary constructions of gender, and how that just doesn't serve a purpose. And I was also really interested in, as we think about getting towards the point where we all engage on this, the point that you make on policies focusing on sexual harassment and not so much on GBV. And I just want to put this in the pot for the other speakers, and as we get ready to think about this. I recently, as part of a sort of political project, because I use writing as a means to effect change on the things that are important to me, I did a novel on violence against women. And so it was ultimately using a different way of writing to have a political message. And what I've found with that is the point that I wanted to make is that it's not just, as South Africans, we've become so desensitized to violence. So the more your intestines fall out on the floor, the more blood there is, the more the media is likely to sit up and take notice. And when I did this book, I tried to work with the notion of emotional and psychological violence and how that is as bad over a period of time because the accumulative effect is as destructive for your health and well-being. And, early readers who read that work felt that we needed more physical violence. I needed to build that in. And it was a very conscious decision to not do that because it is the kinds of emotional and psychological violence that creates the kind of gendered social order that allows for more brutal manifestations of violence. And so I'm just also thinking, inspired by the last presentation, when we think about policies, how do we then think about preventative work that happens to guide students through navigating their way through their relationships? Issues like gaslighting and manipulation, that's not an active something that you can report, but so how do we help in the policies create consciousness about how to have healthy relationships as well? And on that note, I'm going to be quiet and call our next speaker, Dr. Jill Ryan, who is a Stellenbosch University's coordinator for gender nonviolence and is based at the Equality Unit. Within this capacity, she's responsible for the coordination, monitoring, shared responsibility management, and student movement support, as well as to provide training, interventions, and liaising for a comprehensive institutional response to gender violence at Stellenbosch University. Is this an online presentation? Yes, okay. So I'm going to ask you to please try and stick to the 10 minutes. At 10 minutes, I'm going to sort of be very authoritative and march up here in my boots. So if you see me, you know that that's a signal to stop. Thank you, Dr. Ryan, over to you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think also specific to what Vanelli mentioned previously, I think I'll speak largely to that. So with that, I'll just share a presentation I have ready. And then hopefully some of those questions posed and points mentioned will then be responded to. I think while I'm sharing my presentation, I'll also switch off my camera just for the purpose of bandwidth, and I'll switch it back on again as soon as I'm complete. Okay. Is it sharing? Is it fine? Yes. Thank you. Okay, so I think the best way I can share with everyone regarding the policies and the legislative pieces we have at our disposal to kind of respond to this, but also speaking to underreporting, is to do so by situationally or locating it specific to Stellenbosch University. And I can't do that without really mentioning or speaking to the unit I'm from, the equality unit, because it's inextricably tied to that process as well, especially the formation of it and that process that we went about in creating policies and really shaping an adequate institutional response towards GBV or gender nonviolence. So just some background, which I know a lot of our speakers spoke to, so I'll speak to this very quickly, is that since 2016, but we've also seen it starting in 2015, numerous protests around the country really started speaking to sexual violence on campuses and highlighting this issue of GBV within higher education institutions or higher education spaces. However, I think one of our speakers had alluded to this this morning already, that sexual violence has already been a long-standing issue from as early as the 1980s. In that paper, looking at it or addressing it to bring it to light, that was a study done in Rhodes University. However, there is still a lack of nationally representative research providing a clearer understanding of the nature and extent of GBV in higher education institutions, which is often due to underreporting. However, what is known, apologies, is that GBV is linked to a wide range of issues such as drug and alcohol abuse, abuse against marginalized individuals, such as persons with disabilities or gender diverse people, and affecting safety of students and staff on campuses and in student residences, really resulting in this depression and trauma on the part of the victims. So already we're beginning to see that GBV needs to be understood in a very ecological sense, that it's quite pervasive, really working its way into, most sectors within society as well. And as such, students and staff, students and student activists have called for deliberate action through the protest action against unsafe environments and demanding basically transformation to occur at institutions. And then I think I'd like to bring to light that this then highlights the role and us not to undermine the role of advocacy in really pushing forward some of these advancements and progress. But in reflection, and why I highlighted underreporting in the previous slide, is to bring to light some of the reasons that could be behind the underreporting. I see a lot of our panelists had used the article by Prof. Davids, but I thought of using some of the points as well as some of the things that we ourselves have encountered at the Equality Unit through our case management and also through our engagements during workshops, trainings, and interventions. Is that even reflected within a climate survey study we have done with students, we do see that there is unclear, there's no clarity really around institutional processes regarding GBV. So I think, which the previous speaker finally spoke to, was the not knowing what to do when this happens to me. Also, you have the issues around stigma and shame, the fear of victimization, but also you get individuals that are discouraged from opening a case. What do you think it's going to do to your reputation once this gets out? How do you think this is going to affect, let's say, the perpetrator as a career or their studies? So really, it's also a thing of individuals are then discouraged from going forward and opening a case. You also have GBV crimes, or really speaking to the fact that GBV crimes are committed by someone known to them. It can either be an acquaintance, friend, date, or partner. So really speaking to that stranger rape myth that was alluded to by previous panelists, is that we need to understand that about 80 to 90% of these cases is really committed by somebody that we really do know. And I think this also feeds into one of the points earlier mentioned, that this also creates confusion or muddies the water, so to say, when staff or students or those affected by violence are not sure if violence had taken place because it's found within the confines of this trusted or intimate relationship. So I think we can touch on that also in the discussions, because it was also mentioned, I think, even in the first plenary, around really bringing alignment to policies, but also legislation that defines sexual violations or GBV in line with realities experienced, because such as the Coco case that was being mentioned, but also maybe other known types of sexual violations, which we tend to see as sexual violation, but the legislation doesn't, such as the act of stealthing. So also reasons for underreporting is also if substance abuse was involved, or the person affected by violence had been drinking, or even if it's in the context of a party and they were drinking, they're less likely to report this as well. Feeding again back to the stigma, shame, and fear of victimization. But then also you have the issue of systemic failures and poor reporting procedures within the institution. So just to also bring to light some of the key timeline events that helped shape our response in creating different ways in which to address and respond to GBV, started as early as 2015, where students that were aligned with the Open Stellenbosch movement staged a march to raise the discontent with the way sexual harassment was being handled by the institution. Then this led to events taking place in 2016, where the university then appointed a task team to investigate rape culture at the institution, and then to make necessary recommendations. One of the recommendations, which I'll speak to later, was also to implement a survey to kind of better understand the situation at the institution regarding rape culture. But also stemming from this task team was actually the approval of the policy on unfair discrimination and harassment, which ultimately also then led to the establishment of the equality unit. And it's through this unit that we coordinate, educate, and raise awareness around GBV, equality, sexualities, HIV and AIDS, and anti-discrimination among students and staff. And we have roughly 3 portfolios that really speak to that strongly, specifically our unfair discrimination portfolio that deals with cases and case management, with even one member on the team coming from a very strong legal background, having also been an admitted attorney. Further to this, of the policies I mentioned was also the creation of my particular portfolio that started in 2018. And the role of which was, as mentioned by the chair, was to coordinate, monitor, and provide student movement support, as well as training, interventions, and liaising for an institutional, comprehensive institutional response. So it's also to highlight that this particular unit that I'm from is really charged with GBV-related interventions. It's coordinated by the equality unit. So these interventions include communication, marketing of GBV-related awareness campaigns, as well as the prevention and management of cases reported and the monitoring and coordination of this institutional response I keep mentioning. In 2019, when we also saw that spate of protests really intensifying around rape culture and sexual harassment within institutional spaces, Stellenbosch saw the rise of a student-led anti-GBV movement as well, which led to the formation of the anti-GBV task teams, which Vanelli had mentioned that he was part of. So this task teams were actually, this task team was divided in 6 working groups, which was overseen by Rectorate. And these groups were representations of the various university structures. And these 6 working groups really dealt with values and principles, procedures and processes, residence and structures, mental health, alcohol and substance abuse, training and awareness, and safety and security. And these groups were tasked to investigate GBV at Stellenbosch University to state how they impact negatively on the university community. And through this task team came a report which outlined various recommendations linked to line functions and across responsibility centers and faculties on how to adequately speak to GBV. In the same year, you had an online survey.
Jill, can I just ask you to wrap up? The 10 minutes are up and we're running out of time. Sorry about that.
Not a problem. So recently we also then have the review of that unfair and discrimination policy, linked to which, stemming from the task team report, was the GBV strategic plan. And then now currently we also have the GBV monitoring committee, as well as the recently introduced online reporting tool. So to skip through the various guidelines or legislative policies that also aid us in that response, I'll just end off with some of the ways forward in which we can bring in staff, student, and institutional participation around further advancing our GBV responses. And some of those recommendations from those various processes included safety audits, engaging in localized community-based initiatives such as local community police forums. Also, when employing staff, looking out specifically or doing background checks for GBV offenses. Also, really having a strong student peer education network, which really speaks to some of the things which Vanelli mentioned around cultures or rituals or things being done within the resident spaces as well. That is just now some of the points linked to what the peer education networks can address. Then also having student or staff training and workshops really put in place to cultivate an ethos, because as also mentioned, a lot of the policy is very much in a remedial sense, in a very legalized framework, but we also need to create an environment that also brings about prevention as well. Also have senior higher education management really commit strongly and make bold statements in committing to addressing GBV and creating sustained institutional responses. And lastly, supporting those structures. And my main point is to emphasize shared responsibility in enhancing our collective efforts. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was also a very, very insightful presentation. We'll be moving on to the last presentation in this session from Simamkele Lakavu, who is an African Women's Development and Communications Network, African Feminist Macroeconomic Academy Fellow. Wow, that's a lot. She is currently registered for a PhD in political science at the University of Stellenbosch. For the past 3 years, she has been rooted in the South African Academy, having taught gender studies at UCT and at the University of Pretoria. Her area of focus is very exciting. It's social movements, feminist development economics, and the ways in which African feminist activists make claims towards the state and organize politically. I have to just say, yeah, these are things that I'm very personally interested in, so I'm truly excited to hear you speak. Please, can you keep to the 10 minutes?
Sorry, can you increase the volume, please?
How to put the posters back on the wall. I remember those who, on their way to class, stopped by the library benches and joined in conversations, dispelling victim-blaming myths. In place of justice, there were written demands and there were rewritten ones. There were documentary screenings, disruptions and seminars, confessions, personal essays in newspapers. There were solidarity statements and solidarity protests. Bare chests. There were painted backs and shambogs. I remember a flooding river of tweets. There were meetings, endless strategies. There were new homes when we needed refuge. There was artwork and candles, more posters, more seminars, more occupations, more conversations, abundance, creativity, magic. I remember the exhaustion, weak. Fraying threads of wool, we tried to stitch ourselves into something. We lost things we didn't even know we had until they were taken. We didn't win. But today, our best teachers remember us and render us anchor points in a greater struggle. They are odes to us, undutiful daughters. We are defended. There is a record of that meeting where management members walked out on us, leaving a room of wet faces. I remember we reconvened in the SRC offices afterwards, shattered. One of the older women who observed the meeting told us that, growing up, she never thought apartheid would end. We were held, still breaking. 5 years later is an impossible destination. We are still at Purple Square begging for futures, and at the same time, we are in different places realizing time gave up on waiting for justice. In the space I wanted justice to fill, I was forced to make room for new things. There was the relief of hurting in the community, the comfort of being seen as a person with a spirit, the clarity of knowing that we were not the problem. There was a moment I felt my spirit exhale. And then came the vengeful blow of an empire threatened. Like a bulldozer, it succeeded in destroying everything except this. I will always know in my cells what it felt like, that moment we stole, that shared memory of breathing and grieving together.
Hello, everyone. I hope you all heard that video. It was narrated by Yolanda Dyanki, and the words are by Khurata Chitenga. These two are activists who were involved in the RU reference list at the university, still known as Rhodes. And they were both persecuted in many ways for that activism. My talk here today will be centered around African feminist activist interventions to challenge GBV in institutions of higher learning in South Africa. And my intention is to answer, the questions that were posed here for this particular panel around exploring the motivations of underreporting of GBV in institutions of higher learning. And I want to link the ways in which institutions of higher learning have actually been the perpetuators of underreporting themselves due to the persecution and the victimization of GBV victims and survivors. But before then, I just want to share my presentation with you today. Can the admin... Oh. Religion. So my thoughts will also be influenced by my ongoing PhD research in Stellenbosch under the supervision of Professor Amanda Hoos on the 1 in 9 campaign and the interventions that it has brought about in post-apartheid South Africa. And I argue that the 1 in 9 campaign has shaped the ways in which we organize as feminists in this country against sexual violence and GBV as a whole. And I argue that the video that you just saw now of the RU reference list of protests were also shaped by this organization that began in the wake of the Jacob Zuma rape trial many years ago. And before I just go into the details, I want to just honor and remember Fezekile Kuzwayo, who was known as Kwezi, a pseudonym that was given to her for her protection by the 1 in 9 campaign. She challenged a very powerful man and paid the price. And as today, as we see various interventions, whether it's at policy or various laws or various mechanisms that are in place to support survivors. Today, we owe those we owe so much to her for what we currently enjoy. And so I want to firstly speak about the video that you currently saw, which is a video of the RU reference list at Rhodes University. I don't know if many people in the room are aware of the RU reference list and on what took place. But I will just, for those that aren't, I will just give a brief background of the RU reference list. The RU reference list began in 2016 at the university, still known as Rhodes, by university feminists, activists, queer activists, to challenge the university for continuing to protect perpetrators instead of supporting victims who had reported sexual violence or any other form of violence that had been that had impacted their lives. Most of the women who participated in the RU reference list were survivors themselves. They had started a Facebook group and then began naming and shaming the rapists on that particular platform, and they began circulating their faces, where they stayed, using social media under the hashtag RU reference list. Beyond organizing on social media, they organized in person. They gathered on the university grounds and began fetching each of the named perpetrators. And upon, engagements as a community, these women recognized that most of the perpetrators named on that list had abused multiple women. And so they fetched them and gathered them and demanded that they were removed from the university premises or excluded in some form or other from continuing to be in the same space as their victims. However, management responded through with violence, whether it's through private security or police presence, but they also expelled some of the activists, including Yolanda Dyanti, who spoke, who narrated that poem. Yolanda Dyanti was excluded for life by the university and won, recently actually won a legal court challenge against the university. She was supported by SERI, which is the public interest law center that supports socioeconomic justice. And so SERI supported Yolanda through her case, which took many years to fight against being expelled by Rhodes University for her activism for life. And so now Yolanda has started her studies and has begun rebuilding her life. And so when we speak about the underreporting of GBV in institutions of higher learning, we need to look at the systems in place in universities that discourage victims from reporting. We know that underreporting of GBV speaks to the lack of trust in institutional systems and structures, as victims and survivors of abuse believe that reporting processes or outcomes will not only... Excuse me?
It pains me to tell you that you have to wrap up because I'm finding this so engrossing, as is everyone. But I'm going to cry.
I completely understand. Oh my gosh, time has passed so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just wrap up quickly. So basically, I wanted to show that video of the activism that took place at Rhodes University to show that although GBV continues to exist in institutions of higher learning, there is an active feminist response to GBV, and that we cannot just paint women and queer people in these spaces as victims. And we need to acknowledge that response that has taken place, whether it's in the form of naked protests or naming and shaming or petitioning university processes. And that activism has led to many changes. For instance, where my alma mater, Wits University, a whole institution was set up. For Te University, we know that the first ever GBV policy was enacted post this new feminist movement. However, although we have seen some kind of institutional changes in the form of policies or offices being set up, there has been a deliberate pushback, anti-feminist pushback against this activism. And the case of Yolanda Dyanki and many others is an example of how university management, such as Mabizela at the university, the current VC at Rhodes, Mabizela, who have singled out activists such as Yolanda Dyanki and have stopped their lives from progressing, how such actions from university management is discouraging not only future activism, but also discouraging other survivors of speaking against GBV. Thank you.
I really appreciated ending off on that note, because in fact what she's done is to just locate all of this within the lens of feminism and the lens of feminist activism and the costs that come with that, very real costs. So now I have been a terrible, useless chair. We are way over time, and I'm sure I'm never going to get invited back here again. I've been told, how many minutes do I have for a conversation? 20. Okay, so I'm going to, unfortunately, again, we have to be very authoritative about that time. Otherwise, no one's ever going to have me back here again. We have now a big job ahead of us in this 20 minutes, because we're meant to explore the challenges and suggestions and recommendations in both the reporting and policy issues that were brought up. And you will see, I mean, we've heard here from this wealth of knowledge that has been shared here today. We've got our NSP on GBV. We've in fact got the policy framework to address GBV in post-school education and training system. We've also got specific university policies, and clearly these are not working as they should. And then we have this beautiful lens of feminist activism trying to challenge all of that. I'm going to take a round of 5 questions, and then if we have time for another round, we can do that. I suspect it will be 2 rounds at most. Is there anybody?
She made a mistake when she said 20 minutes.
Is it okay? How many minutes do I have?
The session was supposed to end at 3:30.
So can we take 3 questions? Okay. So there's 1, 2, and you want one online one. You can choose a very juicy one for us there. So can I ask the 2 who are in the room to go first?
Okay, so hello everyone. My name is Abongile. I'm a student here at Stellenbosch, and I'm also non-binary. There's diversity in womanhood. How do we go about addressing the issues faced by trans women who are kept in male residences because of the systemic processes as placement policies? This has been happening in the institutions in our country, where trans women and trans men are facing big issues in these spaces. How do we go about addressing that? And also, students have lost trust in systemic processes. How do we go about redressing this issue and also creating accessibility to these structures of addressing the problems that students are facing? Thank you.
Such an important question. Okay, over here.
My question is just generally for anyone on the panel who has thoughts on this. The Criminal Law Sexual Offences and Related Matters Act has recently been amended to impose a mandatory reporting duty on any sexual offence committed against a female student at a higher education institution under 25, or someone who lives in a residence that is typically inhabited by students of that age, and it places the duty generally on anyone who knows of the offence, not necessarily authority figures. And I just wanted to hear from the panelists what their thoughts were on mandatory reporting duties. And it's the same duty that is placed on people for offences against children and people with mental disabilities.
So clear issues of agency.
Yeah.
There. Okay. And the third question, which is online. Okay, so is there one more from the floor, or can we just take the... Sure.
I have a question for Dr. Jill Ryan, especially looking at, she did a timeline, looking at the progress at Stellenbosch University, and I saw quite a number of surveys that have been done by Stellenbosch University, and I'm just curious as to what is the produce of those surveys? What is the outcome of those surveys? Because most of the times in institutions of higher learning, we're being bombarded as students by surveys, being asked what are we going through, but we're not seeing any action from the university. And when we see protests, like Mamkele said, then the university uses inappropriate force to communicate with students instead of sitting down and talking with students. So I'd just like to find out what has been the outcome at Stellenbosch University from Dr. Jill Ryan.
Sure. So can we start there and have Dr. Jill Ryan answer? And then I just want the panel to think about the other two questions. Who would like to respond to the other two? Okay. So let's start with Jill, and then I'm going to ask you to respond to one of the questions.
Thank you so much. I think if time allows, I could maybe touch on, some of those other questions posed as well, especially around accessing some of those processes when we start speaking to the procedures that we want to put in place for policies. Because to my knowledge, and I say that because I'm also I wouldn't say recent appointment, but just over a year, and that's why I asked some of my colleagues to join as well online, maybe to assist in fielding some of these questions. So really around accessing those processes, especially like when we established the Gender-Based Violence Monitoring Committee, we also included student leaders as well as representation, but also to understand that when these policies and strategic plans and those sort of things go out, there is a leg of consultation, meaning it is put out to the Stellenbosch University community for feedback and input. So also those are the things that can also be made use of, because we do notice that sometimes the participation in those processes are low as well, or that engagement. And then I think also reflecting on the agency, because it wasn't only just that sexual offences Act that was amended, but two other legislative pieces as well regarding, I think it was the Domestic Violence Act as well as the another act as well. And I think some of us were also part of that roundtable process that the Social Justice Chair also hosted. So I think that can also be posed not only just to the panelists, but to the room as well, because that, especially that point around agency, was such a contentious issue. Because just as we mentioned, some of the points that was linked to underreporting was around stigma, shame, victimization, and also I think prior panelists in the earlier plenaries as well spoke to how some of those cases are actually dealt with when you start making use of legislative processes and procedures as well. So really that is quite a thing to unpack around the agency and mandatory reporting, especially around GBV issues, because you really still want to respect that agency of the person affected by violence. And then lastly, what was the last question again? Apologies. I'm losing train of thought.
I just want to check it. Finally, Sibonge, were you going to talk to the issue on trans women? Okay. I'd like to be able to give somebody else on the panel opportunity, if that's okay. Do you mind to come up? Dr. Ryan, thank you. I'm going to ask him and then just check with the other panelists if there's something that they want to add before we wrap up the session.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Abongile, for that question. I think the issue of placement of students has been one that has been quite contentious within our university community. Primarily as it relates to issues of gender identity and sexual orientation. And I'm just here, I took some time to open up what was the second version or the second draft of the revised residence placement policy. And this was sent out on the 21st of March, 2022. I'm not aware if there's been a third version, but this is what I look at. And the policy here, sorry, I've lost that. Under policy principles, 6.4 says, SU considers gender identity in placement decisions. Now, I don't know, we can break that down and try and understand what do you mean when you consider gender identity, like what does that mean? But this is something obviously which for me I consider a positive step, because in the previous policy, gender identity I believe was not even mentioned as a consideration for placement of students. Now how that, again, going to the issue of policy versus implementation, what that would look like, we still need to see what that will look like for our residences and our private student organizations, because even though these conversations and issues were being raised around experiences of transgender students or students who identify as non-binary, even though these conversations were happening in different spaces, we continuously saw students being placed in residences that caused harm. So it's a very interesting thing to see and to be able to monitor now that we do have this policy this version of the policy, at least, I'm not certain if it's the final version, but we have this policy now that says we do consider gender identity as to what extent, as to the process, as to who sits around the table to consider, as to what the implications will be, considering that Stellenbosch has majority the segregated residences in terms of gender. What does that mean? Does this mean now all gender non-binary students and transgender students will be sent to a Metanoia or a Goldfields? Those are the only two undergraduate residences that accommodate students that are mixed. So what does this mean? And I think it gives rise again, in conclusion, to even a bigger issue of these residences. So we're trying to change policies and systems, but we're maintaining the structure as it is. If we are to talk about considering gender identity, we need to talk about how the structure exists. We cannot continue having residences that are segregated if we are truly going to be inclusive in nature. So we have the policy, but no conversations around changing the residence structures. So we'll see how that, I'm really interested to see how that will play out. Thank you.
It's such an important point about changing the structural drivers. I'm going to just, in wrapping up, ask Simamkele and Melissa if they want to add anything on those questions, or alternatively plant seeds of intellectual prowess that may germinate and grow in the months to come. Simamkele, can we start with you, and then Melissa?
Hi, everyone. I just want to address the comment made by Mananga Pillay. They said that we have the data and legislation, we have the knowledge, we have the activism and advocacy, but we lack the agency and leadership in both SRC level, both VC level and SRC spaces. We have yet to unpack this space and where the main gap lies. And I completely agree with that comment. And what we see in terms of a lack of leadership or political will at our university spaces, it's also reflected externally, right, in our political spaces and in our government. Recently, we heard Minister Sisulu speaking about castration as a possible solution to GBV. We continuously hear these uncritical, unimaginative, and actually backward suggestions from our leaders in ways that we can solve GBV. And it's very saddening to me and actually enraging to me that our leaders, whether in institutions of higher learning or in government, fail to listen to the people that are actually working daily around GBV, whether that is NGOs and women's rights organizations that are doing this work for the state, whether it's feminist, academics and activist scholars in spaces such as, for instance, Stellenbosch University, activist scholars such as Amanda Hoss or Louise Vincent, right, who have been engaging for decades in this kind of intellectual work in relation to GBV, yet some of the concrete and evidence-backed research fails to be implemented by leadership in various spaces. And I wish they could just read and listen to our practitioners. Thank you.
Thank you. That's such important advice. Melissa, literally a last sentence from you, if you can. Is she still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay.
I think I kind of answered my questions in the comment box, Dr. Joy, but it's fine. I just mentioned that trans students, rather all students, will be given an option to show what they identify as in terms of residence applications from next year at the UFS. But for so long, I'm in a co-ed residence and I've got one trans woman in the female block and one trans woman in the male block. So it kind of depends on how the student wants to see themselves and how they identify and what they're more comfortable with, more importantly. And then as a residence head, the other question was, are we comfortable with the new Criminal Law Act of reporting cases? I am very comfortable with this. We are mandated to report every incident that occurs, and then it's up to the student thereafter if they want to progress with the case and so forth. And there was also another question on my research. I put my email address there, so if anybody wants my books or thesis and so forth on storytelling, it's already up there in the comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So we're going to bring this to a close. I just want to end with two things. The one is that to note the feminist contestation around agency. It is not as simple as it sounds. It's hugely contentious. And then to also note that the issue on trans persons, what was the issue now? It's something to be flagged to take up further. That it's, there were issues I think that came through that are completely unresolved. Because yes, we were talking about residence for men and women, but there are people who identify as gender fluid, gender non-binary, so it becomes a lot more complicated. A huge thank you to the panelists. I mean, I don't know how you felt about that, but I sat there just in awe of the depth of knowledge and the wealth of expertise, really sort of invigorating framing of arguments and critically engaging with the topic. And then I close by saying that I bow prostrate before the prowess of the program directors in how I messed up the time. I'm truly sorry. Thank you to everybody.
Good day, everyone. Now we'll be moving on to the fourth and final plenary panel, which will be looking at exploring the design of recovery panels and counseling programs in institutions of higher learning. with specific focus on rehabilitation and accountability. And I should put a big if rehabilitation is even possible in certain cases. We shouldn't generalize. And our panelists, we will have 4 panelists, and the first panelist will be Professor Thulima Donsela. Professor Thulima Donsela is the Law Trust Chair at the Law Trust Chair here in Social Justice, and she's also the founder of the Tuma Foundation. She said we must cut the bio short, and she will be coming forward to give a presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Program Director. I'm leaving that space to introduce the other panelists because we're running out of time. I haven't given you my presentation. How do we do that? I just have a paper. It's not a presentation. Yes. Yeah, that I sent just now, yes. But just firstly, to congratulate the chair in social justice team, other than me, for putting together this fantastic dialogue, and to congratulate the speakers from the very first person that has addressed us. These speeches have been very structured, very insightful, well-researched, high academic caliber, but at the same time, very relatable to anybody who has an interest in this area. And therefore, I thank the committee that put together the program and sourced these amazing colleagues. I am meant to speak to you about the adequacy of structures at university. I thought it's best, sorry. No, it's gonna be fun. I think this is the mistake that I made here. Thank you so much. And then my laptop, okay, I'll do this like everybody else. Look here. Okay. Oh, what has happened? Yes, I was hoping to have it here as well. So instead of speaking strictly about the structures at university, I'm going to frame it in such a way that, thank you, that we have the broader context of how the structures in society should be for rehabilitation of the victims as they should be at university. So basically, my very brief conversation with you is about gender-based violence in higher education, time to change course on this pressing social justice issue. The 2 things that we're doing, one is to locate the conversation on gender-based violence on social justice. Why we're doing so is for 2 reasons. One, when we talk about gender issues outside the broader societal issues, they often get lost when people are dealing with the issues that affect everyone. But secondly, I have found that it's going to be difficult for us to address gender issues without making progress on other issues of GBV. We've heard speakers this morning, for example, talking about law is part of the solution, but we tend to put all of our eggs in law and the justice system. And all of our speakers have said it's a systemic problem. It's created and reinforced by the system. And if you are going to deal with gender-based violence, you've got to tinker in the system. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't have specific conversations such as today, where we deep dive on gender-based violence. But we then have to then tighten the loop by going back to society. So having with that in mind, then we locate GBV within the context of social justice. Our definition of social justice is that social justice is about equal enjoyment of all rights and freedoms by all social groups. So in a socially just society, you're not just talking about gender equality, or you're talking about the disabled people, or you're talking about LGBTQI. You're talking about a world where everyone's humanity is embraced, and each person, regardless of the way they look or where they come from, enjoys all human rights and freedoms equally with others. And that would be reflected in a just, equitable, and fair distribution of all opportunities, resources, benefits, privileges, and burdens. But somebody by the name of John Rawls simplifies it he just says justice is fairness to all. And social justice is a form of justice that is group justice. So when we talk about justice, it's justice between two people, one stole a cow, one owned the cow, or they entered into a contract and one took the money but did not deliver. So justice is often between two people. But when it's social, you then calibrate society, which is already calibrated. We're not dividing society. Society already, there are already poor people and rich people, women, men, children, old people, black people, white people, and different religions. And in a just world, your belonging to any of these groups should not entitle you to better privileges in society or more burdens in society. That's a just world. Those who deal with social justice from a Gini coefficient point of view would say a socially just society is where the distance in terms of rights and privileges between people is zero, as zero Gini coefficient. And the worst part is when it's one. So if you look at South Africa, for example, where do you think our Gini coefficient is? It's at 0.7. So it's almost like it's getting there to 1, which is the highest Gini coefficient. In countries like Sweden that have consciously designed themselves as social democracies, because they've got similar constitutions as South Africa, the Gini coefficient is at about 0.2, and they still think that's too high. Okay, but I want to then read this from Catherine McKinnon about just the issue of social justice. Can we, is it me who's supposed to, okay. I can't scroll. How do I scroll? Sorry, with colleagues. Okay, thank you.
Both your fingers, both.
Hey, colleagues.
Like this.
That's better. Okay, sorry about that, colleagues. Catherine McKinnon, who is a feminist, says, if women were human, would we have so little voice in public deliberations and in government? In the countries where we live, would we be hidden behind veils and imprisoned in houses and stoned and shot for refusing? Would we be beaten nearly to death, and to death by men with whom we are close? Would we be sexually molested in our families? Would we be raped in genocide to terrorize and eject and destroy our ethnic communities, and raped again in that undeclared war that goes on every day in every country in the world in what is called peacetime? If women were human, would our violation be enjoyed by our violators? And if we were human, when these things happen, would virtually nothing be done about it? I want to hasten to say, this morning we agreed that gender-based violence is violence that is informed by power relations, and power relations attached to the gender differences or constructed gender differences between women and men. And therefore, it's not always violence against women. It could be violence against men. It could be violence between LGBTQI people, or it could be violence against somebody from the LGBTQI community. But it has something to do with gendered power relations and gendered construction of people's places in society. So I'm not going to present the fullness of this paper. What I would have done for you would have been to go and talk to some of the cases that we just experienced recently in the country. So I'm going to just use my last 5 minutes to talk to you very quickly about Officer Buthelezi. Officer Buthelezi is a police colonel who investigated one of the most difficult cases on GBV. It was a guy who targeted students, and when she finally nabbed him, he was responsible for 36 students, specifically targeted students and nobody else. And he would pretend it's his birthday. It's a long story, which I'm not going to waste your time on. And then within them, look at the one that he considers insecure enough, target her, and then find a pretext to go with her, something to do with his birthday, and then rape her. And this officer fixed this, and this guy is behind jail for many years. He is not going to come out. But what will you learn from this case, and many of these cases, is that with GBV, you need 4 factors. You need a prevention, and this is what she says herself, that she has caught so many. Because her husband was killed and the police did a shoddy job, and she became a detective and vowed that nobody would ever escape going to jail because there was a shoddy job. And today, this officer Buthelezi, Joyce Buthelezi, has never lost a single case. Whether it was murder or it was rape, she's gotten all of them locked. So, but what we discovered from this case is that you need a system that still prevents, because even though in those spaces where she is, she has nabbed these guys, you're still getting serial rapists, and some of them are still targeting students. But you do need accountability, and this is where an officer like her becomes extremely important. And this accountability in the context of universities, we need the accountability in the universities, and people have told us about the structures that exist. But we also need accountability out there, because one of the things we did earlier this morning, sometimes our discussions seemed to suggest there's a university, it's a whole community on its own, and there's a society there. The reality is that they interface. And this is what you get from the so-called birthday rapist. That is the guy who targeted students, raped them, and took their cell phones. From a prevention point of view, what we discussed with Officer Buthelezi was, we need to know, why does a person like this do this? And this is where she said, we need psychologists. Because if we don't know why this person specifically targets university students, we won't know who else is doing that. We are going to say it's historical traumas, it's things like that, but you need to be specific, because she says, if we're specific about what's the motivation, and she's found out some of it, but she doesn't want to go public, is that we can then predict who is going to be violent, and we can predict who's likely to have committed the crime. It gets narrow, you narrow it down. So you need very clear accountability mechanisms in the university and for the offenders. But you also need accountability for the accountability mechanisms. In other words, the policemen, the judges, the prosecutors need to be held accountable too. That's why you have public protectors and all of these other institutions. The third element that we need is restoration. You'll find it in that long paper. That restoration, you need it for victims because there's no point in having a court system that holds the victim, the offender accountable to save our society from the pain of feeling violated, but it doesn't save the victim from the pain of having been violated. But also the restoration is about how do you restore the humanity of the victim, of the offender as well. Because something is wrong with their humanity to do what they're doing. That's why we're talking also about bringing into this space the possibility of trauma theories and trauma strategies, as well as the issue of neuroscience. The last thing that you need is reintegration of both the offender and the victim. Whether you're talking society or you're talking at university. What we have there then is a table. In this paper, you'll see a table that shows what each institution does in the institutions where we were able to find out what are they doing. There are 26 universities, so we've done only a few exemplary ones, the big ones. What we'll need you to help us with is to find out what the other universities within the group of 26 are doing. But ultimately want to know, what are they doing to prevent? And you'll see in the table, they talk about education, they talk about induction processes and having codes of conducts and policies. What are the accountability structures? Are they really working? Are they specialists, or are they just generic structures? Are they effective? Thirdly, is there restoration? And what emerges when it comes to restoration, and I hope you'll agree with me, is that the emphasis on the criminal justice system, which at universities is a disciplinary system. The equivalent of a criminal justice system at university is a disciplinary system. It still loses the victim. But what seems to be emerging, and I'll hear from you if I'm wrong, is that it also loses the offender. Because if it's very adversarial, there's often no opportunity for the offender to confront their wrongfulness, to confront their humanity. The same way as Pumla Gobodo got the child of a victim of Eugene de Kock to come face to face with him, and both recognizes each other's humanity, and the offender realized that a human died that night and that other humans suffered as a consequence, and that was because of what he did. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof, for that. Our next panelist is going to be Sarah Anna Sydenham. Sarah Emma is a student at Stellenbosch University, currently pursuing her LLM under the supervision of Prof. Madonsela. Her research focuses on restorative justice to center restitution of GBV survivors within the criminal justice system. She is also the director of a nonprofit organization called Post Parliament, which advocates for survivors of GBV and promotes youth education on the topic of GBV. Take it to the stage. Thank you. Brilliant. Is that working? No.
I think it might be flat, it's fine. The slides are mostly for my benefit. I can just say next slide. So yes, as Chilitsi pointed out, I am pursuing my master's, and today I'm going to discuss a little bit of my research, particularly on how restorative justice can work for gender-based violence survivors, and in what circumstances, because as discussed previously, it's a very complex umbrella term that is